Hello, everybody. Earlier this week, we did a show with my old friend Nicholas Carr, one of the most persistent and convincing critics of technology. Talking to him, he's written many books warning us about the slippery slope of technology, how we're losing our humanity. We talked about a 2012 article he wrote called The Arc of Innovation Bends Towards Decadence. And as he suggested in our conversation, we are outsourcing our humanity increasingly to technology, to the tech industry. We're becoming data, he warned, and that is undermining who we are. Carr was a very early critic of technology. Many others have followed, and we have a new book out this week called Mind Masters, the data-driven science of predicting and changing human behavior, which also in its own way warns us about the dark side of data technology. It's written by my guest, Sandra Matz, who is a professor at Columbia Business School. How much of a warning, Sandra, congratulations on the new book, is Mind Masters? What are you warning about?
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for having me. I would say it's actually a pretty balanced view. So I think it's warning about the risks of having our data out there, having others or giving others the ability to peek into our really kind of intimate psychological needs, preferences, motivations, and influencing not just how we think and how we feel, but also our behavior. So it certainly talks about the potential loss of privacy, the potential loss of agency, self-determination, but then also looks at the bright side.
What are you saying that hasn't been said before? I mean, so many books have been written about this. What is it about Mind Masters that should convince people who are immersed in this literature, whether it's Nick Carr or Douglas Rushkoff or Sherry Turkle? What are you saying?
Yeah, so I think there's maybe a few points. So the number one, where I started was actually that everybody's talking about privacy. Fewer people are talking about the loss of self-determination. So maybe a few of the people that you mentioned are really talking about, well, it's not just an intrusion into our lives. It's actually it's kind of taking away our ability to make our own choices. So I think that is one point that some people are not thinking about. And I really try to not only talk about the positives, but really think of solutions. So how do we, instead of just pushing regulation that's usually trying to mitigate risks, right, and kind of try to protect people from the most egregious abuses, but how do we introduce new forms of data governance that help individuals maximize the utility? So I think, like in the form of data co-ops, I think that's something that I haven't seen as much before.
Well, before we get to the solutions, let's address the problems. Are you suggesting that there's a potential with this ubiquitous digital technology for us to lose our agency, our ability to determine our own fates?
I think very much so, right? As I think human behavior was always influenced by others. So I think that the idea that we're fully in charge of our own choices was always an illusion, because we're so influenced by the people around us, by the situation that we're in. I think anyone who's ever gone grocery shopping hungry knows that we're not always fully in charge of the decisions that we make, but it's been really put on steroids in the context of these algorithms and recommendation systems. Because even if you're not changing someone's core identity, right? So we're not necessarily taking someone who is extremely conservative, has been a Republican for their entire life, and we're turning them now into an advocate for Democrats. But what we can certainly do is we can just make some of the paths of your life more likely. So if you're undecided whether you want to go out and vote at all, if you're undecided about which job to take potentially, those are all things that we can influence by essentially understanding who you are on the inside and then using those insights into to make predictions and recommendations.
You write a lot in the book Mind Masters about psychological targeting. What exactly is that? How does it work? I mean, how do the tech companies or the algorithms know, for example, that we're looking for a new job?
Yeah. So the way that I think of psychological targeting is essentially in two steps. And for all the data nerds out there, I think of it as like reading from the mind and then writing into the mind. So step number one is taking a look at all the data that you generate, and it can range anywhere from what you post on social media, so very explicit identity claims, to some of the traces that you typically leave without much thinking. So all of the data that gets captured by your smartphone sensors, right, where you go, what you do, who you're connected with, who you meet, and so on. And what we can do with the help of machine learning AI, and now also actually generative AI, is translate those traces into more meaningful, or like at least human interpretable psychological constructs. So something like your values, your personality, your moral foundations, your political ideology. And then based on these predictions, we can say, well, okay, now that I know that you might be more neurotic than someone else, or that you might be more impulsive than the average person, how do I tap into these psychological traits and frame the way that I talk to you, or change the way that I talk to you, the communication, both the content and the style, to tap into that and speak to those motivations. That's kind of psychological targeting. So both reading, trying to predict who you are, and then the second part is tapping into these motivations.
So is psychological targeting what you're writing about in Mind Masters? Are the Mind Masters the advertising platforms, the algorithms that control the advertising business, or content platforms like Netflix or Amazon that determine what we want to watch or what we want to buy?
So I mostly thought about Mind Masters of the algorithms, because they're taking the data and they're just insanely good, right, at turning vast amounts of data into something that is interpretable at a psychological level. But you're absolutely right in that algorithms are written by humans, right? And essentially the question of what do we optimize for? Are we optimizing for attention? Are we optimizing for clicks? Are we optimizing for time spent on platforms? Those are all goals that humans give those algorithms. So at the higher level, at the meta level, it's certainly the humans behind these algorithms.
But could you give me some examples? Are these mid-level companies? Are these companies we've heard of, or is it the usual suspects, the Googles, the OpenAIs, the Amazons, the Facebooks, the Instagrams of the world?
So it used to be the case that it was actually relatively difficult to build these predictive models, because what you needed was a proprietary data set that connected your data. So anything, again, could be your Facebook likes, could be your what you post on Twitter or X, could be like your credit card spending. And you needed some way of connecting that to psychological constructs and then train your model over that data. So back in the day, it was mostly the big companies, right? So Facebook has a patent for predicting personality traits from the data that they capture on their platform. So the fact that they were very surprised about Cambridge Analytica, I think, was not necessarily following what they'd known internally for a while. But now that we have generative AI, that's changed entirely. So again, you don't need a model anymore that's dedicated to specific tasks, say translate what someone posts on X to the personality trait of extroversion, because generative AI is built on the entire internet. It knows everything about psychology. So anyone can now take any data that you generate, Google searches, credit card spending, social media posting, pop it into ChatGPT, so any off-the-shelf language model, and ask it, well, what do you think is the personality of that person? What do you think is their political orientation? What do you think are the moral values that they follow? And it does a pretty remarkable job at making those predictions, even though it's never been explicitly trained. And you can imagine that democratizes access and just makes it accessible for anyone.
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm not entirely clear on what you're saying. So let's use myself as an example.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is there are companies, individuals that will go to OpenAI or Anthropic and ask these large language models what I want, what I do. Would they be able to tell it? And why are they doing it? And what would they do with the information if they find, for example, from OpenAI that I buy a lot of business books on the dark side of technology?
Yeah. So I think it's a great question. So you can imagine, like, take a medium-sized business, they're trying to figure out, and let's make it like a company that sells books, right? So they're trying to figure out what are some of the books that you're interested in. Now, what you can traditionally do is you can take all of the data traces that you generate and then make direct predictions and say, okay, from everything that I know about you, we're going to predict that the next book that you're going to buy is Weapons of Math Destruction, because that has technology and looks at the dark side. Now, what we're trying to do is essentially put like this intermediary step in the middle and say, from everything that I know about you based on the data that you generate, can I extract insights that humans can interpret so that we're not just predicting which book you're going to buy next, but potentially also change the way that we talk to you, right? Again, if I understand that you're interested in technology because you're extremely anxious about what might happen with humanity based on technology, I might kind of emphasize different aspects of the book or suggest a different book entirely. If I understand that the reason for why you're interested in technology is because you're extremely open-minded and curious, I might actually, again, highlight different aspects of like, here's what technology can do, kind of focus on more of the progress side. So I think that's what we're trying to do. And this is, again, what now off-the-shelf models can do, is I can just feed it the data that I have about you and say, you tell me, is Andrew more open-minded, more neurotic, and maybe tell me even how I should approach him when I'm trying to sell him a book on technology.
So I still don't really understand what you talk about, something called off-the-shelf models.
Yeah.
Could you give me some examples of these kind of models? Is it available? And I'm guessing that bookstores are not buying this off-the-shelf model so that they're able to sell their potential customers more directed products, whether it's clothes shops or bookshops or any other sales business.
I think there's actually a lot more.
Could you give me an example of what an off-the-shelf model is?
So when I mean off-the-shelf model is ChatGPT. ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude 3. So all of the large language models that you've heard of that have an easy-to-use interface, right? It could be just like a chatbot. It could be speech. It could be an API. And so I've seen quite a lot of medium-sized businesses or even startups try to use everything that they have, because oftentimes they don't have proprietary models, right? Facebook doesn't necessarily need to translate someone's data into a psychological profile because they have the entire universe of data. If you're a small business and you only have so many data points about a person, either because you've collected them yourself as first-party data or you've purchased them from data brokers, now you benefit the most from using something like ChatGPT and kind of asking it, okay, based on everything that you know, because you've read the entire internet, who do you think that person is and how should I be talking to them? What are some of the things that they care about? How do they want to be talked about? What are some of the products in our series of products that they might be responding to best? So I think it's even more important for the smaller businesses because they don't have the entire data set that the large companies have.
So again, I don't really understand what you're saying, Sandra. So what you're saying, in these smaller companies, you have some IT person who is subscribing to OpenAI or Gemini or Claude, the Anthropic platform, and are then using AI technology to essentially master what consumers or other individuals want, learning more and more about people. So these AI platforms are spying on us. Is that what you're saying?
It's usually not the IT person, right? It's usually the marketing person that has been tasked with trying kind of gain more insights into consumers' needs and preferences. So they might work with a person who is on the tech side to get those insights through an API, but the ask is typically coming from the marketing folks that are trying to figure out who the consumers are. And now what happens with those insights, that is usually still left up to marketers, right? So that's also one of the reasons for why it's actually helpful to translate your data into something like you're impulsive or you're neurotic. Because once a company, again, like let's pick a small, medium-sized company, once they have annotated their customer profiles with some of these psychological traits, it's typically a marketing person who decides, okay, here's some of the things that we can then do. Can they get the assistance of something like ChatGPT to make these decisions? Absolutely. But it's usually a human in the loop.
Yeah, on your website, you have a test your personality interface, suggesting that you can determine your personality. What's the point of that? And do we need to protect ourselves so that we're less visible online? Because I don't think anyone wants to become the laboratory rat of these salespeople who want to master everything we want and everything we think.
Yeah, so the reason for why the personality test is there is, first of all, there's a lot of examples in the book, and I think once you understand whether you are more extroverted, more introverted, more neurotic, more emotionally stable, it's much easier to relate some of the examples that are in the book. But it also just gives you some self insight. So there are studies showing that the more you understand about yourself and the traits that you might be targeted based on, the more likely you are to actually spot when someone is doing that. And again, it's still really tricky because like we have limited attention, right? So most of the time we don't necessarily have our guards up, and we have better stuff to do than trying to figure out specifically which traits an ad has been targeted to. But it certainly gives you like some level of insight into what could be the dimensions that others are using to target you. And to be fair, I'm not, so there's certainly like a dark side that is all about manipulation, but you could imagine that the same things are being used to help you save more money or improve your mental health. So I don't think it's necessarily just a way for people to manipulate you behind your back without any consent.
Is there any difference between the way you're interpreting these large language models, and I'm not convinced that that's the core of what large language models are, and traditional search? I mean, isn't that what Google did? You can always use Google to search for people, find out more about them, find out what their traits are, what they want, what they do.
So I think it's fragmented. So the reason for why, and I'm not saying that like you always need psychological traits. If you just want to predict what someone is going to do next, and you might just be able to take the entire swath of data that you have on someone and feed it into an algorithm. The reason for why I think this intermediary step of psychology is actually interesting is that, first of all, it makes people care about the topic a lot more, right? So the reason for, at least in my opinion, why Cambridge Analytica blew up is that people suddenly felt, well, if someone can use my data to predict that I'm impulsive and neurotic and use it to exploit me, that suddenly felt a lot more intimate than saying, hey, I'm just getting access to all of your searches, all of your social media data, and all of your GPS records. Because we don't think about humans in those terms, right? We think of humans as these holistic beings and not just a combination of different data sources. So one is, I think, that it helps highlight how intrusive some of these models are. And the second step is that oftentimes, because there's still a human in the loop, right? So whether that's the customer service person that talks to you, or whether that's the person in the store, and that's typically completely disconnected from anything that happens offline, there's some value in kind of not having just an algorithm understand you based on all of the data, but translate it into something that is simpler and that humans can make sense of. And that's the when essentially psychology and personality comes in.
You brought up Cambridge Analytica a couple of times. I haven't had that company for a while. I mean, that was a long time ago, almost 10 years ago. And it's like a couple of centuries ago in tech terms. You also wrote about the rapid spread of election disinformation for the last election. But it seemed as if that problem is less prominent than it was. And how does this fit in with Mind Masters? Most people seem to have concluded, a lot of people aren't particularly happy that Donald Trump won the election, but was in your view, at least, did he win partly because of your Mind Masters? Did he have Mind Masters running his campaign that determined how we were going to vote and bombed people with data and advertising? Huge amounts of money, of course, were spent. Kamala Harris spent more than Trump and lost the election.
Yeah. I mean, I would actually say that that's the job of most of the people working on these campaigns, right? So it's always been the case that campaigns have been using data to try and figure out who to target, who are the undecided voters, and what message resonates most with them. So I don't think anything has changed with the introduction of Cambridge Analytica, other than, again, the fact that people suddenly felt it was a lot more intimate because they could suddenly make sense of the way that companies use data. Now, for me, the part of Cambridge Analytica was never did it win the election or not. That's why I think it's still relevant. It just means kind of coming back to what we talked about in the beginning. If there's someone that can interfere with your decisions based on an understanding of who you are, psychology or not, completely to decide, right? Take data, take psychology, I don't necessarily care. But someone can use data to get an understanding of what you might be doing and then influence that behavior. that's something that I think all of us should care, because it's not just in the context of elections, it's also in the context of all of the decisions that you make on a daily basis. And those are a lot, right? Anything from which products do you buy, which job do you take, are you going to get a loan or not? And if those are no longer our own, I think it's something that we should be concerned about even 10 years after Cambridge Analytica.
Yeah, you noted at the beginning of this conversation that the book Mind Masters isn't a warning, but I think a lot of people are going to be listening to this and be profoundly chilled. You said that one of the original things in the book, and again, you're not the first or the last to make these warnings about big tech, about knowing everything about us and selling us stuff that they know we want, or showing us ads that they know will have an impact. You talked about your solutions, data sharing in particular. What exactly does that mean? You talk about new companies, new platforms. What does that mean?
So I think there's two approaches, or two things that I think we're not talking about enough that I think are more interesting solutions than just regulation, which I also think we need, by the way. But one is technology. And what I mean by that, like a specific example would be something like federated learning or distributed learning, where we can create intelligence machines without necessarily having to collect all the data in one place. So Apple's Siri, for example, it's not that Apple collects all of your voice data, all of your speech data on a central server to train their models. What they do is they make use of the fact that you have a supercomputer in your pocket, right? Your smartphone is so much more powerful than the rockets that we used to launch, like the computers that we used to launch rockets into space with. So what they can do is they can essentially say, look, your voice data never leaves your phone. We're going to send our model to your phone. We're going to update based on all of the data that we find there. We send the intelligence back, so we still collectively benefit and we can collectively make our models better. But it's a way of protecting your data and not now having the responsibility to safeguard the data that you sent us in a central server. So that's, I think, for me, one of the technologies that would be able to break down this almost like this trade-off that we've had for centuries, which is either I can get something like service, personalization, convenience, or privacy and something like self-determination. And if that's the choice, the human brain will always go for the immediate reward. So technology is one. And the second one is different forms of data governance. So the specific example that I mentioned in the book that I think is really promising is data co-ops. And what that is, I'm going to give you a specific example, which I really like, in the medical context, is essentially it's people who have a shared interest in using data. So there's one in Switzerland that's called My Data, for example. They are working with patients who suffer from MS. So MS is a disease that's poorly understood because it's incredibly complicated. It's determined by genetics, by your medical history, by your lifestyle, by your surroundings. And so you need a lot of data from a lot of patients if you truly want to understand how you might be able to help someone who suffers from that disease. And so what My Data does, it's essentially a data corp that is owned by its members in the same way that financial institutions have fiduciary responsibilities to act in the best interest of their customers. So they're legally obligated to act in the best interest of their members. Now the data corp can essentially say, we're going to collect data from all of these patients who suffer from MS and also a control group, so we can contrast. And now we not only learn something about the disease, but we also can use it directly to help the patients in the moment. So insights from the app are directly sent to the doctor to say, well, here's something that we learned based on all the data and the insights that we gathered. Maybe try this treatment because patients who look similar have traditionally responded better to these treatments. And then you have a feedback loop where the doctors can send information back on whether the treatment worked or not. Totally different idea, right? So the way that it currently works is that these platforms collect all of the data, they commercialize the data, they benefit from your data. There's like the saying of, if you're not paying for a service, you're the product. And data corps totally turn this on its head, because you're essentially own part of the data corp. You have a say in the governance of it, how data is being used, and you directly benefit. So I think technology like federated learning and new forms of data governance like these data corps, I think, are the most promising solutions.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up Apple. Their business model, of course, is not a data, for the most part, not a data model. Their business model is selling hardware, although they're more and more in the software business too. Does that mean, in terms of your Apple example, that alternative big tech companies like OpenAI or Google might not be able to do what Apple is able to do?
It's a great question, because you're right in that, like, why is Apple doing it, right? They're a B2C. Their customer is the user. So they have a much easier time advocating for privacy, kind of taking down the cookies, using federated learning. But Google, for example, is doing the same. So Google is another one of these platforms that is heavily advocating for federated learning and also developing a lot of the technology and making it open source. So it's not just Apple. I think it's much harder for companies like Facebook, right? So if you make money by selling consumer data and selling it either to advertisers or directly, you might not necessarily be advocating for technologies that keep the data in the hands of consumers. So you're absolutely right. There's different incentives across some of the tech companies.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up Facebook. They are pioneering and aggressively pushing what they call an open source AI platform, Llama. Is that a problem or a solution? Do you believe in the idea that open source, whatever that means, in the way that Facebook are using it or Meta is using it, can be more trusted than perhaps OpenAI or Google?
So I think in the context of large language models, it's great to have an open source model. Right now, their model is just not on par with some of the other ones. So it's just right now, I think not as powerful. But I think the reason for why they're doing it in the context of LLMs is that they're not currently losing that much money on it. But if they were shifting to something like federated learning, that would mean that they're not collecting all of the user data. So as long as they benefit from ads on the platform, I think it's easier for them to do something open source and regain some of the trust from consumers in a different context where there's not necessarily that much, they're not taking as big of a hit to their business bottom line.
You talked about the need for regulation. We've done many shows on AI. Gary Marcus, a couple of weeks ago, one of AI's great skeptics, believes that in the long run, artificial general intelligence, AGI, is inevitable, might happen in the next 20 or 30 years. Is that why we need regulation? And what kind of regulation are you suggesting?
Yeah, so, and I agree. So I think it's really, like, based on the leaps that we've seen in recent years, I think it's hard to imagine that there's a world where we might not get there. Regulation is tricky, right? So what if you kind of look to the European Union, for example, that I think is again among the first to try and regulate AI, it's almost impossible to regulate the technology itself because technology moves at light speed, right? And we know that regulation typically doesn't. But so what they're trying to regulate is certain purposes and certain use cases. And I think that is much easier to use. So the simplest example is if we're using AI in the context of vulnerable populations, so that is mostly kind of teenagers, young people, the barrier to doing that is much, much, much higher. So you have to kind of jump through a whole lot more loops to be able to put that on the market than when you say you just have like a simple recommendation algorithm that sells you toothpaste. So I think for me, the idea of saying, well, we're not necessarily focusing on technology itself, but we're focusing on protecting certain groups. We're kind of trying to see what are some of the conditions or like some of the contexts in which we don't want to use it, right? You could imagine we might say that elections, the stakes are too high and we're trying to not use it there. Now, is it always going to protect us from all possible abuses? Probably not, right? So there's still going to be bad apples and bad actors that are trying to circumvent some of the regulation. But I think it just sends a signal of what are some of the things that we care about in the context of technology. So that is like a path that I think is promising in a world that is just incredibly difficult to regulate.
And finally, Sandra, what about you noted earlier that yours was a balanced book, this new book, Mind Masters, the data-driven science of predicting and changing human behavior. There's a behavioral economics component to this. And I know your book comes with some blurbs from some very distinguished behavioral economists. Do you believe in nudging people? Is that valuable when it comes to, for example, the environment, of behaving more responsibly, of not using plastics or driving EVs? What are the more positive ways in which the data-driven science of predicting and changing human behavior should and can be used?
Yeah. So on the nudging piece, I think generally speaking, I mean, I've been doing this research now for 10, 15 years. I think I've become less optimistic about the power of nudges, just because I think anything that requires the individual to change is going to be a much harder sell and has like a lot less impact than having these systemic changes, right? If I can introduce something like federated learning, the chances that actually someone is going to benefit from technology is so much bigger than trying to send them a couple of nudges to use their data more responsibly or to put some money in the bank or something. The context that, or the use case that I'm probably the most excited about on the positive side is mental health. Right. So there's like, it's one of these fields where we haven't seen much progress in the last couple of years. There's a huge gap in terms of how much demand there is for mental health support, and how much supply there is. So I think for every, like according to the WHO, I think for every 100,000 people looking for treatment, there's 13 professional therapists. So what AI and technology can help us with is actually two parts. One is it can help us track mental health. So if I can, for example, tap into your smartphone sensors and look at your GPS records, I see that you're not leaving your house as much anymore. There's much less physical activity. You're deviating from your daily routines. It's not a diagnosis, but it could be a signal that you might be suffering from depression. So we might just have like an early warning system that says, hey, it might be nothing. Maybe you're just on vacation and enjoying yourself. In this case, completely disregard. If you're not, maybe look into something. And here's some resources that we can send you that are customized to you. And then obviously on the treatment part as well. So I think there's a lot of ways in which you can either get therapists up to speed, so train them using large language models, artificial agents that both mimic patients and supervisors that help you catch up on the latest science that we have, and also as autonomous therapists and coaches, right? I'm not necessarily saying that they're replacing therapists, but they're probably a good alternative for anyone who doesn't have access to healthcare at all. So I think that's a context where, again, could be used to exploit people. So again, coming back to Facebook, they were accused of predicting whether teenagers were suffering from depression, anxiety, low self-esteem to sell them out to advertisers. Clearly not something that we want to do, and like very much on the dark side. But same idea of like, once we understand that someone might be suffering from like mental health problems, we can also use it to help them.
It's interesting you bring up that in early February, we're doing a show with Daniel Oberhaus, who has a new book out. It's called The Silicon Shrink, How Artificial Intelligence Made the World an Asylum. And he's concerned with the implications of what you're talking about, given our obsession with mental health, given the supposed anxiety, particularly of young people. Everyone who uses services that you're outlining, describing, will feel as if they're insane. So the entire world, or our network world, becomes one insane asylum. Is that realistic? Isn't that rather chilling?
So
You're
to
saying
me,
that every time you don't go out, you get a warning saying, well, are you depressed? You sound like it's ubiquitous therapy. Therapy is already relatively ubiquitous in cultural terms. More and more young people are going to therapists. More and more people feel that they're suffering from some sort of mental ill health or another. Isn't what you're suggesting just one way of compounding that cultural crisis so that everyone feels as if they're mad?
So to me, that's a question of like, how do we talk about this, right? So first of all, most of the time people go to see a therapist when it's already too late. Most of the time you actually go there when you have an acute problem, not when you're trying to see if you can become more resilient or tackle your problems early on. And I think you're absolutely right. The way that I've talked about it is essentially like mental health problems, but there's also like a lot of ways in which you can say, well, can we use AI just to kind of make you better off if you kind of have a hard time exercising enough, and I see that you're walking or spending time outside, and I see that you're walking past a park, maybe I suggest that you spend some time out there in nature. So I'm not as concerned about this idea that just
Who's
because we
making
talk
this?
about it.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, no, good.
Who's making these suggestions? Is it Apple? We wear our Apple Watch, so if we don't go out, the Apple know everything we do if we wear an Apple Watch or we carry an iPhone around. Are you suggesting that Apple sends us messages, or partners of Apple send us messages saying you need to go out more, you need to exercise, we're worried you're depressed?
Yeah. So in this case, and everything that I've talked about in the context of like mental health tracking or just kind of making you better off, I think this should be always with consent, right? So I'm not talking about Google and Apple poking around and sending you these kind of early warning systems. This should be something for people who say, I want to keep track of how I'm doing. Maybe I know that I've suffered from depression historically, right? Maybe I've been there 2 or 3 times, and I want to make sure that next time I catch it a lot earlier. So I would never recommend that this is something that is kind of introduced into every single device that we're using. But this one should be a lot more kind of a pull factor where people say, no, I do think I might be struggling from some of these things, or I want to improve and become better. And so it's like really, first of all, with users' consent, and because they're trying to achieve something and become a better version of themselves.
But you know as well as I do that user consent is an easy thing to get, and online companies and platforms are very good at getting us to tick those boxes. So,
and this is not what I mean by this.
Are we protected from this brave new world where we're being followed all the time by your mind masters who will know ways of suggesting to us that we're depressed and perhaps sell us products or therapists or new drugs?
Absolutely not. So I think one of the ways, and then this has actually changed quite a lot in my thinking over the last 10 years. I was always very optimistic about if we only educate people like about technology and we tell them what's happening with their data, they're going to be able to do it. And I've become a lot more pessimistic. It's just a complete uphill battle, right? So if you were to efficiently and successfully manage your data, you would have to not only keep up with technology, and that's already impossible. It would also be more than a full-time job, right? You don't have the time to read through all of the terms and conditions before you give you consent, manage all of the permissions of every single app that you download, every single website that you visit. So you're absolutely right in that. My argument is that we can't put it on consumers. And ironically, a lot of the regulation that we see is based on these pillars, right? Look at them like European GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, CCPA in California. They're all based on transparency and control. So tell consumers what's happening with their data and give them the control to manage it. And in my opinion, I mean, I think you need it in combination with something like data co-ops and federated learning. But in and by itself, if it's just a consumer, it's not a right to manage your data. It's much more of a responsibility and burden that we're not really equipped to take on, right? Instead of holding companies accountable, it's just saying, well, Andrew, congratulations, now you're in charge of everything and managing your data. And if you sign away your data, well, that's up to you. So you made the mistake. So I think I 100% agree that consent in today's world it's not informed consent. It's certainly not informed in the sense that people know what they're doing.
Well, Sandra Matz, you've convinced me. Take off my Google Watch, get rid of my iPhone. You say you're balanced, but actually it's a rather chilling vision of the future. Mind masters, the data-driven science of predicting and changing human behavior. It's an interesting view of the world.